The sentiment today that's like, well, God only cares about your sincerity, not about, truth. God's fine with your good intentions, even if you don't directly obey his commands. Friends, God cares about what we believe about him, and he cares about what we do to obey him. These are not small things. We need to accept God on his terms in the Bible, not ours. The ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite for 3 months, and the Lord blessed him and his entire household. Wait a second. David didn't expect this. No one's dead. The lightning bolts haven't hit Obed or any of his children. No one has tumors everywhere. The opposite is true. Everyone's blessed. Like, life is awesome. Everything is just going incredibly well, not just for him, but his whole household. And so David has experienced the anger and the danger of God's glory, but now he's starting to see, wait a second, it's possible to be in the presence of God and experience his blessing. How? How is that possible for both those things to be true at the same time? C.S. Lewis was after this in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, in the Chronicles of Narnia series. Aslan, the lion, he's like the God figure, the Christ figure. And early on, Mr. and Mrs. Beaver were describing to the children what Aslan is like. And they said, if anybody can walk into the presence of Aslan without their knees knocking, they're either braver than I or they're just foolish. And so little Lucy says, well, is he safe? And Mr. Beaver replies, safe? Who said anything about safe? He's not safe. Of course he's not safe, but he's good. He's good. He's not safe, but he's good. And this is what David is now sitting in. He's not safe, but he's good. So how do these things dwell together where we can live with a dangerous God like this? David learned the lesson. How did he learn the lesson? We don't know for sure, but I'm assuming he went back to the Torah, went back to the law of God, and had some aha moments, because look at what happens. Verse 12, it says, so David went to bring up the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David with rejoicing. Not with fear, not with trembling, not with terror. You would expect that after what happened. He's going with rejoicing. How? How can he be rejoicing? Look at verse 13. When those who were carrying the ark of the Lord had taken 6 steps, he sacrificed a bull and a fattened calf. Wearing a linen ephod, David was dancing before the Lord with all of his might. And while he and all Israel were bringing up the ark of the Lord with shouts and the sound of trumpets. I say, what is going on here? David probably getting out of the Bible, getting the Bible out for himself, or maybe talking to Obed-Edom and learning what God said, made sure this time he wasn't foolhardy. He wasn't, overlooking God, the seriousness of his sin and God's instructions. This time he obeyed God to the T. We don't hear anything about an ox cart. This time it says men were carrying it. Presumably the Levites from Obed-Edom's house. Presumably they got the poles out, put them in the rings, put them on their shoulders like they were supposed to. So the first thing we see is obedience. He obeyed God's instruction. But secondly, that's not all. Look what else he did. It says David was wearing a linen ephod. So what is a linen ephod? It's kind of like a priest's PJs. It's like a priest's underwear, okay? It's just like long flowing linen garment that they would wear underneath their priest gowns, right? So you say, well, why in the world is David the king not wearing kingly robes? Why is he wearing priest underwear? Well, the reason he's wearing priest underwear is because David is not in this moment acting in his role as a king. He's acting in his role of a priest. Now, what did the priests do in the Old Testament? They did not go, God bless you. They did not hand out the Eucharist. That's not what the priests did back then. What did the priests do? They killed animals for sacrifices on behalf of the intercession for the people for their sins. What was David doing? He's wearing his linen ephod. He's saying, I'm presenting myself as a priest before the Lord. What do? 6 steps in, they make a sacrifice. Why 6 steps? I think the reason is because 7 is a sacred number. It's like the holy number of God, right? It's a perfect number. I think what they're saying symbolically is before we enter into the holy presence of God, we are going to have this sacrifice. Why did he sacrifice a bull? Why did he sacrifice this calf? Well, to understand this, we need to understand something about the sacrificial system. What was this whole sacrificial system thing about for the Jewish people? Between the priest and the Holy of Holies Ark of the Covenant, there was a sacrifice table, a place where sacrifices would happen. And what the priest would do, the high priest would come in once a year, and he'd put his hand on the animal, the pure, spotless animal that was about to be sacrificed. And by putting his hand on this animal, he was essentially saying, this is what I deserve, and this is what our people deserve because of our sin. And then he would kill the animal and sprinkle the blood as the way, the instruction that God gave to say, this will cover. I will choose to overlook the death of something pure and innocent to cover over the sins of the people for this year. And this is what happened. So what is David doing? He's slaughtering the animal before the presence of the Lord. He's recognizing his own sinfulness, that he does not deserve to be in the presence of God, that someone else, something else needs to die in order for him to experience the grace and the goodness and the mercy of God, because his sin cannot be before a dangerous God. David finally understood this, and he began to experience the goodness of God, the mercy of God, so much so that he began rejoicing and worshiping in his priest's underwear. I mean, just dancing and having a great time. Everybody starts to party and rejoice because everybody begins to understand this same thing together. David doesn't present himself as the high king, but rather as the humble, undeserved sinner, saved and welcomed into the good presence of God through the sacrifice of another. And so this is as far as we're going to go in the story, because I want to talk about you and me a little bit here this morning. You say, I've seen the movie. Ark's not around anymore. It's in some, warehouse or some secret government facility in a box somewhere. So, we don't have the Ark anymore. So what does any of this have to do with you and me today? I want to share two thoughts. One about obedience and one about sacrifice with you. The first one about obedience. When I was a kid, those books, those little books that they make for the bathroom, like to sit behind the toilet when you do your business? Y'all know what I'm talking about. Before phones, which is gross. But like those books were gross too. Anyway, they had these little books in there and you would read them, while you're doing your business. And one of those books that I remember, it was a popular little bathroom book back then. It was called Don't Sweat the Small Stuff. Maybe some of you remember it in the 90s. And the subtitle was and everything is small stuff. Don't sweat the small stuff, and it's all small stuff. And there's some good, interesting things in there. But I remember even as a kid in my grandmother's bathroom thinking, well, that's just not true. And I still think the same thing today is, well, wait a second, not everything is small stuff. There's a lot of stuff that's not small stuff. It's kind of big stuff. Just tell your wife or your significant other or your mom or your dad, oh, yeah, that's small stuff. They'll go, no, not small stuff. David realizes there's some things that are not small stuff when they come to obedience of God, when it comes to the truth of who God is. And I think one of the things that I think we need today, what we need today is a fear of the Lord. I think we're missing the fear of the Lord. The Proverbs start saying the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. You want to be a wise person? Begin with the fear and the awe and the reverence of who God is and his holiness. And there's a flippancy today that I see with this, even among Christians, friends. A flippancy about the holiness of God. The sentiment today that's like, well, God only cares about your sincerity, not about, truth. You can kind of believe whatever you want as long as you're sincere. God's fine with all that. Or, God's fine with your good intentions, even if you don't directly obey his commands. Friends, God cares about what we believe about him, and he cares about what we do to obey him. These are not small things. We need to accept God on his terms in the Bible, not ours. Have you ever seen one of those stories? I had a TikTok video I was going to show, but I'm not going to. It's somebody who crashed into a storefront like right in the intersection, just kept going right through the intersection into the storefront. Why? Because they were looking at their GPS and their GPS told them to go straight. Now imagine that person being angry at the storefront. Oh, you shouldn't have been there. My GPS says you're not here. It's your fault. Say, that's crazy. You should have been paying attention, you should have been paying attention to what is reality, what's right in front of you, not what's virtual, but what is actually in front of you. Can you imagine in the same way? When we just train wreck our lives because we just choose to not accept God on his own terms, choose not to accept God for who he is, and then we train wreck our lives and getting mad at God about it. Friends, if we choose not to accept that God is a God of mercy, we will train wreck our lives over guilt. If we choose to believe that God is not a God of love, we will train wreck our lives through cold indifference and damned good works that don't earn us favor before the Lord. If we refuse to believe that God is holy, we will either train wreck our lives into flippancy or thinking that, we're good enough, everything's fine. We must accept God on his own terms, not on ours. We need to accept what God says about morality. We need to accept what God says about his commands about our sex life and about how we use our money and our possessions and how we treat people that we don't agree with and how we conduct ourselves on social media and what we allow our eyes to watch and our ears to listen to and how we conduct our business and anything else that the Bible speaks of. And so here's my question for you. The first question around obedience is this: where does the holiness and the fear of the Lord need to purify your beliefs about God and your obedience to God? Where does the holiness and the fear of the Lord need to purify your beliefs about God and your obedience to God? That's the first thought I want to leave you. Here's the second. We'll close with this. The second thought is about sacrifice. We face the same dilemma as David. How can the presence of God be with me in blessing and goodness if God is so dangerously holy? It's one of the great tensions of the Bible is that we cannot live without God and we can't live with God. That how do we deal with this tension? He's the God who might break out against us because of our sin like he did with Uzzah. But he's also the good God who blesses Obed-Edom and his household and blesses David in his presence and gives him joy. So how does this fit together? Because like Uzzah, we're like Uzzah, right? Like we're not always going to get it right. We might even have good intentions, but we do it wrong. We're not always going to be perfectly obedient. And so should we walk around on eggshells around God and just like hope he doesn't send a lightning bolt down to strike us? And the reality is that's like how a lot of people think about God. Is this God? That's not a relationship with a loving Father. So to resolve the tension we need to look to what David looked to. What did David look to? He looked not just to his obedience and his moral effort, he looked primarily to sacrifice. Because that sacrifice of the bull and the calf was not an end to themselves. Those sacrifices, even for David, pointed beyond themselves to something far greater, a far greater and more permanent and ultimate sacrifice, the Son of God, Jesus Christ of Nazareth, who went to the cross, not even in his linen garments, but stripped bare naked before the Lord and before all those who watched. Who Hebrews 9 tells us that the blood of bulls and goats cannot permanently take away sin, but the once and for all sacrifice of Jesus did. At the cross, God's dangerous holiness broke out against Jesus, the beloved one, in our place, so that we can now experience his holy presence forever with great joy. Not out of being afraid of God, having fear in all of God, but not being afraid of him, but experiencing the fullness of his mercy and his grace and his forgiveness and his acceptance forever and ever, that we get to be called sons and daughters of the Most High God, where Romans 8 says there's now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. Because the law of sin and death is gone. We now live under the law of the life of God. And so now we can dwell with him forever and ever. if, and only if, listen, this is the most important part of the whole message, we can now dwell with God in safety and the goodness, experience the goodness and all the fruits of being in a relationship with God, if and only if we, like David, embrace the sacrifice of the Son.